What a beautiful house. Valerie smiled, running her manicured hands over the custom mahogany dining table my late husband Nathaniel and I had commissioned in Italy 30 years ago. My mother will love it. We are moving in. She did not ask, she did not suggest. She simply stated it as a fact while walking through my foyer in her designer heels. She was already pointing at the load-bearing walls. We will knock this down to open up the space. The master suite will be for us, and your old office can be for my mom. I sat there sipping my black coffee and let her finish her little interior design fantasy. I watched her twirl her oversized diamond ring, a ring paid for by the salary my company provided to her husband. I let the silence stretch until the grandfather clock in the corner ticked loud enough to make her stop and look at me. Then I set my mug down on the saucer with a soft clink and calmly said no. Everything stopped. My name is Beatrice Montgomery. I am 68 years old, and I did not survive 40 years in the cutthroat Atlanta commercial logistics industry to let a girl with a maxed-out credit card evict me from my own empire. But what my son and his wife did next proved they were not just disrespectful. They were dangerous. No. Valerie repeated the word as if I had just spoken to her in a foreign language. Her fake, sugary smile vanished instantly, replaced by a tight, thin line of pure entitlement. She looked over her shoulder at my son, who was shifting uncomfortably near the entryway of the formal living room. "Desmond, tell your mother what we agreed on." Desmond cleared his throat, refusing to meet my eyes. At 42 years old, he still wore the expensive bespoke suits I bought for him, reeking of unearned confidence and imported cologne. He stepped into the light but kept his gaze fixed on the Persian rug. "Mom, be reasonable. This house is 12,000 square feet. It is too much for you to manage alone since Dad passed. We have already signed the lease for your new apartment at Whispering Pines Assisted Living. It is a very nice and secure facility." Assisted living. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. "Desmond, I ran a 10-mile charity marathon last weekend, and I closed a $40 million warehouse acquisition for Montgomery National Logistics just yesterday. My mind and my body are sharper than yours have ever been. I am not moving out of the home your father and I built from the ground up." Valerie crossed her arms, her acrylic nails tapping aggressively against her elbows. "Beatrice, this was not a request. We already gave notice at our penthouse. The movers are literally down the street waiting for my signal. Then I suggest you call them and redirect them to a hotel." I picked up my tablet to check my morning emails, dismissing her entirely. "The front door is right behind you. Make sure it locks when you leave." Desmond took a heavy step forward, his face hardening. The nervous, hesitant son was gone. In his place stood a greedy stranger, desperate and cornered. He reached into his leather briefcase and slammed a thick manila folder onto my mahogany table. "I did not want to do it this way, Mom, but you leave me no choice." He pulled out a document stamped with a Georgia state seal. "This is an emergency medical power of attorney and a preliminary medical directive signed by a judge this morning. Dr. Sterling assessed you last month. He testified on record that your recent severe forgetfulness and cognitive decline make you utterly unfit to manage your personal estate or Montgomery Logistics." The air in the room turned to ice. Dr. Sterling, the expensive concierge physician Desmond had practically begged me to see 3 weeks ago for a routine checkup. Desmond had insisted on driving me himself, claiming he wanted to spend quality time with his mother. He had sat in the waiting room while the doctor asked me a series of strange, repetitive questions about my memory and my daily routines. I thought it was just a thorough geriatric exam. They had set me up, they had laid a trap and smiled to my face while they did it. "You declared me incompetent." I kept my voice dangerously low, not letting a single ounce of panic show on my face. "It is for your own good, Beatrice," Valerie chimed in, practically vibrating with excitement as she looked around my house. "The movers are pulling up to the gates right now. Do not make us call the authorities to have you physically escorted out. It would be so embarrassing for the neighbors to see." I did not scream. I did not cry. Crying is a luxury for people who do not have a strategy. 40 years as a black woman, navigating the white male-dominated logistics industry had taught me one fundamental rule. When a snake bites, you do not waste time complaining about the poison. You find an axe and you cut off its head. I looked at the legal document. Desmond had outsmarted himself. He assumed that a piece of paper signed by a bribed doctor would make me crumble into a weeping mess. He assumed I would throw a fit, beg for mercy, or try to fight him right there in the foyer while his hired movers boxed up my wedding china. He forgot who raised him. Fine, I said smoothly, standing up and sliding the folder back toward him. Well, I suppose I have some packing to do. Valerie's eyes lit up with arrogant triumph. She actually reached out and attempted to pat my shoulder, but my glare stopped her hand in midair. You are making the right choice, she sneered. It is time for the younger generation to take the wheel. You can rest now. I picked up my cell phone from the table. I did not dial a lawyer. I did not call my company executives. I scrolled to a number I had saved for over 20 years and pressed call. Desmond frowned. Mom, who are you calling? Put the phone down. You do not have the legal authority to make estate decisions anymore. I held up one finger, silencing him as the line connected. Chief Warren, it is Beatrice Montgomery. I need a personal favor. I heard Desmond suck in a sharp breath. Chief Marcus Warren of the Atlanta Police Department had been a rookie cop when my late husband helped his family pro bono with a massive civil rights case. He owed the Montgomery family a debt he swore he would never forget. Yes, Beatrice. Chief Warren's deep voice came through the speaker. What do you need? I have 3 unauthorized commercial moving trucks idling outside the private gates of my Buckhead estate. I said, my eyes locked dead onto my son's pale face. I need you to send 2 patrol cars to hold them outside my property line for exactly 1 hour. If they attempt to breach the gate, arrest the drivers for trespassing. Done, Chief Warren said without asking a single question. Patrol units are 2 minutes away. I hung up the phone and slipped it into my pocket. Valerie looked like she was about to explode. You cannot do that. We have a court order. We have the right to move in today. You have a medical directive, Desmond. I corrected him, walking slowly toward the grand staircase. Not an eviction notice. A medical directive takes 30 days to process through the probate courts before you can legally alter my residency without my consent. You thought you could bully me into leaving today because you are desperate. But I know the law better than your bargain bin lawyers do. Desmond stepped toward the stairs, blocking my path. Mom, do not make this harder than it has to be. The board of directors already received a copy of this medical directive. You are suspended from the company. You have nothing. I looked at this man, this boy who I carried for 9 months, who I rocked to sleep when he had a fever, who I bailed out of every financial mistake he made in his 20s. The love I had for him died right there on the bottom step of my staircase, replaced by a cold, calculated precision. Move out of my way, Desmond, I said. My tone was so quiet, so absolute, that he instinctively took a step back. I walked up the sweeping staircase, my posture perfectly straight. I went into my master bedroom and pulled my vintage leather overnight bag from the closet. I did not pack my jewelry. I did not pack my financial ledgers. I simply packed 3 changes of clothes, my personal laptop, and the secure encrypted hard drive my husband had entrusted to me before he died. I walked back down the stairs 10 minutes later. Valerie was pacing the foyer, frantically texting someone on her phone, while Desmond rubbed his temples, looking like a man realizing he had just kicked a sleeping bear. Outside the heavy oak doors, I could hear the faint sound of police sirens approaching the neighborhood. My 1-hour buffer had arrived. I walked past them, pulling my bag. I opened the heavy front door, letting the warm Georgia air flood into the cold house. I paused on the threshold and looked back at my son. He was staring at the floor, unable to look me in the eye. Take the house, Desmond, I said, my voice carrying across the marble foyer. I hope you can afford the ghosts. I closed the door behind me, leaving them in the silence of the empire they thought they just conquered. My driver, Thomas, was already waiting by my black sedan, his face a mask of professional stoicism, though I knew he had seen the police cars blocking the moving trucks at the gate. Take me to the Ritz-Carlton, Thomas, I said, sliding into the back seat, and hand me my secure tablet. We have a war to win. As the car glided down the long driveway past the frustrated movers and the flashing blue lights of the police cruisers, I opened my secure tablet. Desmond thought he had won the game because he captured a single pawn. He did not realize I owned the entire board. It was time to show my son exactly why the industry called me the Iron Widow. For the first few minutes after the gates disappeared behind us, I said nothing. Thomas knew better than to fill silence merely because it was uncomfortable. He drove with both hands steady on the wheel while I watched the familiar streets of Buckhead pass outside the tinted glass. Every tree, every stone wall, every corner carried some memory of the life Nathaniel and I had built. We had arrived in Atlanta with more determination than cash, And for years, every financial decision had been a choice between what we wanted and what the company needed. The mansion had come much later, after the first profitable distribution contract, after the second warehouse, after the years when we signed payroll checks before we paid ourselves. That was why Desmond's betrayal felt larger than a fight over rooms. He had reduced a lifetime of discipline to square footage and resale value. He looked at the house and saw a trophy. I looked at it and saw every night Nathaniel came home smelling of diesel and rain. Every breakfast we ate over expansion maps, every birthday, Desmond celebrated under that roof. The anger in me was real, but anger was not useful until it had direction. I opened the encrypted hard drive on my lap and checked that the old emergency archive still answered to Nathaniel's recovery key. It did. The sight of the familiar authentication screen steadied me. Years earlier, when our company was still small enough for one dishonest manager to create a crisis, Nathaniel had insisted that every major asset charter provision board resolution and security protocol be duplicated outside the main network. I used to call redundancy boring until the day it saved your life. Desmond knew the public version of our corporate structure because I had taught him enough to work inside it. He did not know all the safeguards because he had never shown the patience to learn why they existed. That difference mattered now. I told Thomas not to take the direct route to the hotel. We made one extra loop through Midtown while I disabled my ordinary phone, moved essential contacts to the burner, and changed the access phrase on the encrypted drive. I was not hiding from my son. I was denying him the ability to predict me. By the time the Ritz-Carlton appeared ahead of us, I had stopped thinking like a mother who had been betrayed. I was thinking like the chief executive who had survived hostile competitors, predatory lenders, labor crises, and men who smiled while trying to steal the company from underneath me. Desmond had chosen the battlefield. I would choose the rules. The lobby of the Ritz-Carlton was quiet and smelled of expensive citrus and polished marble. Thomas stood silently behind me, holding my single vintage leather travel bag. I walked up to the front desk with the perfect posture my mother taught me 60 years ago. The young man behind the counter smiled warmly and welcomed me by name. I have stayed here many times over the years when Nathaniel and I needed a weekend away from the demands of the company. I asked for the presidential suite for an indefinite period. He typed into his computer and nodded politely, asking for my card to put on file. I handed him my black corporate card. He swiped it. A slight frown creased his forehead. He swiped it again and gave me an apologetic look. He told me the card was showing up as restricted. I did not blink. I simply opened my wallet and handed him my personal platinum card. He swiped that one, and the machine beeped twice. His face flushed bright red. He looked around the lobby nervously and leaned in close. He whispered that my personal card was declining due to a sudden total account freeze. I felt a cold sensation wash over the back of my neck. Desmond had moved faster than I anticipated. He did not just want to embarrass me in my own foyer. He wanted to paralyze me completely. He knew that a woman with my resources could hire a team of vicious corporate litigators within an hour. So he used that fake medical directive to contact the banks and freeze every single asset bearing my name. He wanted me sleeping on the street. He wanted me begging him for access to my own money. I did not let the young man behind the desk see a single ounce of panic. I calmly reached into the hidden compartment of my travel bag. Nathaniel always told me that electronic money was an illusion and that a smart woman always keeps tangible power within arm's reach. I pulled out a thick banded stack of $100 bills. I handed the concierge $10,000 in cash and told him I would require the suite for the next few days. He swallowed hard, took the cash, and handed me the heavy brass key card. Once the heavy door of the presidential suite closed behind me, I walked straight to the floor-to-ceiling windows. I looked out over the glittering skyline of Atlanta, a city I had helped build, a city where my trucks moved millions of tons of freight every single year. My own son thought he could lock me out of my life. I pulled my burner phone from my coat pocket. I dialed the only person left in my bloodline who possessed an ounce of integrity. Isaiah answered on the second ring. I told my grandson to pack his forensic accounting equipment and come to the hotel immediately. I told him to make sure no one saw him leave his campus apartment. 20 minutes later, there was a gentle knock at my door. I opened it to find Isaiah standing there in his university sweatpants with a heavy backpack slung over his shoulder. At 23 years old, he was the spitting image of his grandfather, Nathaniel. He had the same sharp, observant eyes and the same quiet intensity. He had completed graduate training in forensic accounting and was finishing advanced coursework in corporate compliance. He walked into the suite, dropped his bag on the glass dining table, and pulled out two heavily modified laptops. I sat across from him and explained exactly what happened at the house. I told him about Valerie demanding the master bedroom. I told him about Desmond slapping that fraudulent medical directive on the table. I told him how they froze my banking profile to cut off my oxygen. Isaiah clenched his jaw, his hands curled into fists on the table. He told me he was going to call his law professors and have Desmond dragged into court by morning for elder abuse and fraud. I placed my hand over his and told him to stop. I explained that if we brought the police into this right now, Desmond would play the victim. He would claim he was just a concerned son trying to protect his sick mother. The courts would drag the process out for months. Meanwhile, the news of my supposed dementia would leak to the press. The board of directors would panic. Our stock would plummet. The logistics empire Nathaniel and I bled to build would be torn apart by nervous shareholders before I could even clear my name. We could not fight this with raw emotion. We had to dismantle Desmond surgically. Isaiah understood immediately. He opened his laptops, and his fingers began to fly across the keyboards. He asked me for my corporate tablet. I slid it across the table. He connected it to his network using a maze of thick black cables. He told me that Desmond had likely wiped my user profile from the Montgomery National Logistics mainframe, but Desmond was an arrogant fool who knew nothing about real cybersecurity. Isaiah explained that before my husband died, Nathaniel had hardwired a ghost administrator profile deeply into the server architecture. It was a backdoor entrance that bypassed the modern security protocols completely. It was designed specifically for moments of catastrophic crisis. Within 15 minutes, Isaiah bypassed the firewalls. The screen flashed black and then flooded with the internal financial dashboards of my company. I told Isaiah to pull up the executive discretionary accounts. These were the emergency liquid funds the company held for sudden acquisitions or supply chain disasters. Isaiah typed a few commands. The numbers populated on the screen. My heart stopped. The accounts were completely drained. Over $9 million in cash reserves had vanished. Isaiah leaned closer to the screen, the blue light reflecting in his eyes. He started tracing the routing numbers, tracking where the money had bled out over the past 8 months. He told me Desmond was not just skimming off the top to pay himself a higher salary. Desmond was hemorrhaging cash through a complex web of offshore shell companies. We sat in silence as Isaiah decoded the digital blood trail. Desmond thought he was a brilliant investor. He had taken millions in company money and funneled it into highly volatile underground cryptocurrency exchanges. He bought at the absolute peak of the market, hoping to double the company profits and look like a genius to the board of directors. But the market crashed. The data showed that Desmond lost over $6 million in a span of 3 weeks. He panicked. Instead of coming to me, he tried to gamble his way out of the hole. He lost another $1 million doing that. Then Isaiah pulled up the secondary ledgers. He found a dummy vendor account listed as Valor Consulting Services. This fake vendor was billing Montgomery Logistics nearly $50,000 a month for phantom supply chain optimization reports. Isaiah tracked the destination of the payments. The money was routing directly into a private credit account held by Valerie. I stared at the itemized expenses Valerie had been charging to my company. $100,000 shopping sprees at boutique fashion houses in Paris, exclusive memberships to elite country clubs where she could flaunt her stolen wealth, lease payments on 2 imported luxury vehicles. She was financing her entire high society illusion using the money my truck drivers broke their backs to earn. But as angry as I was, the numbers still did not make sense. I told Isaiah to look deeper. I told him that even with the crypto losses and Valerie draining the accounts, Desmond had a massive deficit. He needed immediate capital to cover up the missing $9 million before the quarterly audit. If the board saw that the cash reserves were gone, he would be facing federal prison. He needed an influx of cash right now. Isaiah cracked his knuckles and dove into a restricted subfolder labeled Project Salvation. The folder was heavily encrypted, but the ghost access bypassed the locks. A massive document filled the screen. It was a commercial loan agreement. I read the header and felt the breath leave my lungs. The loan was for $15 million. The lender was listed as Apex Heritage Capital. They were a notorious predatory private equity firm operating out of New York. In the business world, we called them corporate vultures. They specifically targeted vulnerable asset-rich companies. They offered massive short-term loans with insane interest rates. When the targeted company inevitably failed to make the impossible payments, Apex Heritage would swoop in, seize control, and carve the company up to sell for parts. They would liquidate fleets. They would sell off warehouses to developers. They would fire thousands of hardworking people just to squeeze out a profit. Isaiah scrolled down to the collateral section of the contract. His voice dropped to a terrified whisper. He read the terms aloud. Desmond had leveraged 30% of the Montgomery Logistics voting shares as collateral, but the firm required more security for a $15 million cash loan, so Desmond pledged the deed to the Buckhead mansion. I leaned back in my chair. The puzzle pieces finally snapped together, forming a picture of pure evil. Desmond did not declare me incompetent just because Valerie wanted a new house. He declared me incompetent because he needed to eliminate me from the equation before the loan came due. Nana, Isaiah said, pointing at the bottom of the digital document. Look at the signature line. I looked. There, boldly printed on the final page of the loan agreement, was my electronic signature, alongside my official digital notary stamp. He forged my name, I whispered. Isaiah nodded, his face pale with shock. He needed your authorization to leverage the company stock and the house. Since he could not ask you, he stole your digital identity. He submitted this loan agreement 3 months ago. I looked at the specific terms of the contract. It was a 90-day balloon loan. The total $15 million plus $3 million in predatory interest was due in full on Monday morning, less than 5 days away. If the payment was not made, the contract stipulated an automatic trigger. Apex Heritage Capital would legally assume ownership of the 30% company stake and the deed to my home. Desmond knew he could not pay back the $18 million. He never intended to. He took the $15 million from the loan sharks, paid back the missing $9 million to the company accounts to hide his crypto theft from the auditors, and pocketed the remaining $6 million for himself and Valerie. He planned to let the loan default. He was perfectly happy letting corporate vultures seize my company and my house as long as he could walk away rich and clear of any criminal embezzlement charges. He threw me out of my house today because he knows the collection agents from Apex Heritage are coming to seize the property on Monday, I said, my voice turning as cold and hard as a diamond. He wants me locked away in an assisted living facility pumped full of sedatives before the corporate sharks kick the front door down. He wants me silenced so I cannot contest the forged signatures. Isaiah slammed his fist on the table, rattling the coffee cups. He told me this was federal wire fraud. He said we had all the proof we needed right here on the screen. He reached for his phone to call the FBI. I stopped him again. I looked at the complex legal document on the screen. Desmond thought he had tied a perfect knot. He thought he could steal $15 million, sell out his father's legacy, and leave his own mother to take the fall. He thought that because I was 68 years old, I would just cry in a nursing home while my life was auctioned off. I stood up from the table and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window. I looked out at the lights of Atlanta. A fierce, burning energy ignited in my chest. I did not want Desmond to just go to jail. Prison was too easy. Prison was a quiet room where he would not have to face the people he betrayed. I wanted him to feel the exact same terror he tried to force onto me. I wanted Valerie to watch her fake high society life crumble into dust. Isaiah asked me what I was thinking. I turned around and looked at my grandson. I told him to draft a very specific legal document. I told him we were not going to stop the predatory loan. We were going to let the trap snap shut. But we were going to make sure Desmond was the one standing on the trigger. That night, Isaiah and I built a chronology before we built a counterattack. We placed every relevant event in order on the dining table of the suite: the strange medical appointment, the first unexplained restrictions on my accounts, the transfers to the crypto exchanges, the fake vendor payments, the forged loan, and finally the attempt to force me out of the house. Seeing the sequence on one page changed the emotional shape of the betrayal. None of it had been spontaneous. Desmond had not panicked that morning and made one terrible choice. He had spent months constructing a system in which every lie supported the next one. The false diagnosis gave him a story for the board. The board gave him access to authority. Authority was supposed to give him access to the reserves. The reserves were supposed to hide the loan. And the assisted living plan was designed to place me somewhere he could describe every protest as another symptom. It was ugly, but it was also useful. A complicated fraud creates more evidence than a simple theft because every step leaves another record. Isaiah copied the critical files to 3 encrypted devices and generated verification hashes so no one could later claim we had altered the data. 1 copy stayed with him, 1 went into my travel bag, the 3rd was prepared for counsel. I instructed him not to delete, modify, or even rename anything on the company servers. We were not going to behave like intruders in our own system. His role was preservation and observation until the corporate charter gave him formal authority. That distinction mattered to me. Desmond had built his plan by violating rules whenever they became inconvenient. I intended to beat him by making the rules close around him. We also separated our objectives. First, protect Montgomery National Logistics from the Apex loan. Second, preserve evidence of the embezzlement and forged signature. Third, prevent Desmond from draining another dollar while believing he still had a path to rescue himself. Fourth, clear my name without creating a public panic that would hurt employees who had nothing to do with our family war. Isaiah wanted immediate justice. I wanted controlled justice. There was a difference. If we exposed everything before the company was insulated, innocent people could lose paychecks while lawyers argued. If we waited too long, Desmond could destroy records or move money. The transition audit clause gave us the narrow window we needed. Before Isaiah finally closed his laptop, I made him promise one thing. Whatever happened next, he was not to turn this into a personal contest with his uncle. He could be angry, but the evidence had to stay cleaner than our emotions. He nodded and said Nathaniel would have told him the same thing. Hearing my husband's name in that quiet hotel suite hurt more than I expected. Nathaniel had spent his life preparing the company for storms from banks, competitors, recessions, and regulators. Neither of us had imagined the storm would carry our son's name. I went to bed for less than 3 hours. When I woke before dawn, my grief had not disappeared. It had simply become organized. The next morning, I walked through the sliding glass doors of Montgomery National Logistics headquarters. I did not wear the comfortable cardigan of a retiring grandmother. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, a string of South Sea pearls, and a pair of heels that clicked against the marble floor like a metronome counting down to an execution. Desmond had wasted no time. He had called an emergency meeting of the board of directors for 9 in the morning. I entered the boardroom on the 50th floor exactly 2 minutes late. The massive mahogany table seated 12 of the most powerful corporate figures in Atlanta. At the head of the table where my husband used to sit, and where I had presided for the last decade, sat Desmond. He had already moved his leather portfolio into my space. Valerie was not there because this was business, but I knew she was probably waiting at a luxury cafe downstairs, picking out new curtains for my house on her phone. Desmond looked up and offered a smile that dripped with rehearsed pity. He gestured to a chair halfway down the table. "Mom, please take a seat. We were just about to begin." I ignored his assigned seating. I walked directly to the opposite end of the table and remained standing. I looked at the board members. I had personally recruited half of them. The other half Desmond had been aggressively courting over expensive golf trips and private dinners. I saw guilt in some eyes and naked ambition in others. "Let us not waste time, Desmond," I said, my voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "You called an emergency session. Present your agenda." Desmond stood up. He adjusted his tie and put on a mask of deep sorrow. He addressed the board with a voice thick with fake emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the hardest day of my professional life. As you all know, my mother has led this company with incredible strength since my father passed. But recently, her health has taken a severe turn." He slid copies of a thick file across the polished wood. "I have provided each of you with a certified medical assessment from Dr. Sterling, a highly respected physician in this city. The diagnosis is early onset dementia. Her cognitive decline has become rapid and unpredictable. For her own safety and for the stability of Montgomery National Logistics, my mother can no longer serve as chief executive officer." A heavy murmur swept through the room. Robert Franklin, a board member who had always favored Desmond, flipped through the medical packet with aggressive speed. "These findings are definitive, Beatrice," he said, without meeting my eyes. "The doctor notes severe memory lapses, paranoia, and an inability to process complex financial data. We have a fiduciary duty to the shareholders. We cannot have a compromised executive at the helm." I studied Robert instead of the report. His tie was perfectly centered. His cuffs were polished, and yet he kept rubbing his thumb along the edge of the same page as if the paper might somehow reassure him. 2 younger directors nodded too quickly. One woman near the windows did not nod at all. She watched Desmond. That interested me more than anything written in Dr. Sterling's file. Desmond had spent weeks preparing these people for a battle. He had expected me to pound the table, attack the doctor, accuse the board of betrayal, and give every nervous director an excuse to call me unstable. My lawyer shifted beside me, ready to speak, but I touched his sleeve and stopped him. The room needed to hear less from me, not more. I let the silence stretch until the directors began looking at one another. Then I lowered my eyes to the polished table and said, "The doctor is right." The reaction was immediate. A chair creaked. Someone inhaled sharply. Desmond's face went blank for half a second before relief flooded it. He had prepared a defense against my anger, and suddenly had nothing to defend against. Beatrice, one of my oldest allies, said quietly, "Are you sure we can order another evaluation? We can slow this down." I looked toward him and gave the smallest shake of my head. "I will not turn this company into a public family spectacle," I said. "If stepping aside protects the people who work here, then I will step aside." That was not weakness. It was the first move of a structure Nathaniel and I had built decades before Desmond ever learned how to knot a silk tie. Desmond did not know that. He only heard surrender. "No," I replied, forcing my voice to sound incredibly tired. "I have been forgetting things. Important things. The stress of managing this empire without Nathaniel has finally taken its toll. I do not want to drag the company my husband loved into a public spectacle over my declining mind. I will not put our shareholders at risk." Desmond practically beamed. He tried to hide his triumphant smirk behind a cough, but I saw it. He thought he had broken me. I thought the fake diagnosis had actually convinced me that I was losing my mind. "Thank you, Mom," Desmond said, his voice dripping with condescension. "That is incredibly brave of you. The board appreciates your willingness to step aside gracefully. I am prepared to step in as interim CEO immediately pending a formal vote." Robert Franklin immediately raised his hand. "I second the motion to appoint Desmond Montgomery as interim chief executive officer effective immediately." Several other hands went up in rapid succession. They were circling like vultures, ready to anoint their new king. "Before we vote," I said, raising my head. The slight tremble in my hands vanished. My posture straightened completely. Since we are strictly following corporate procedure today, we must adhere to the foundational bylaws of Montgomery National Logistics. Desmond frowned, his eyes narrowing. "What bylaws?" "The medical directive gives me the authority to assume your duties." "The medical directive gives you authority over my personal estate, Desmond," I corrected him smoothly. "It does not rewrite corporate governance. Nathaniel and I drafted the founding charter of this company 30 years ago. Article 4, Section 12 specifically addresses the sudden medical incapacitation of a seated chief executive. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents on heavy cream-colored parchment. I slid them down the length of the table. "I suggest you read it, Robert, since you are so deeply concerned with our fiduciary duty." Robert picked up the document. He read it in silence. His face began to lose its color. "Read it aloud," I commanded. Robert swallowed hard. "In the event that a seated chief executive officer voluntarily steps down or is removed due to sudden medical incapacitation, an immediate and mandatory transitional audit must be conducted. To prevent internal conflict of interest, the outgoing executive reserves the sole and exclusive right to appoint an independent transition auditor." Desmond stepped away from the head of the table. "An auditor. We already have internal accountants. We do not need outside interference during a transition." "It is not a suggestion, Desmond," I said. "It is a mandatory transition safeguard in the charter. Until the independent transition auditor clears the books, the incoming executive cannot move restricted reserves, approve extraordinary financing, or alter protected records." The effect on him was almost physical. He stopped pacing, his hand flattened against the table. For 1 second, he forgot the performance of the concerned son and looked exactly like a man who had just heard a door lock behind him. "You cannot freeze executive authority over some ancient technicality," he snapped. "Daily operations require flexibility. Vendors need answers. Fuel contracts need approvals." I watched 3 directors exchange glances. They knew those routine functions did not require the kind of unrestricted access he was demanding. Our operating systems had layers. Desmond wanted the one layer Nathaniel had designed to be difficult to reach. "You will have every authority the charter allows," I said. "Nothing more until the transition review is complete." "Fine," he said too quickly. "Bring in one of your old accounting firms. Let them waste a day and clear me. I have nothing to hide." "I am not appointing a firm," I replied. The charter allows any qualified individual meeting the forensic accounting requirements. At that exact moment, the heavy double doors opened. Isaiah entered in a navy suit carrying a metal briefcase. He did not hurry. He did not look at me first. He looked at the board, then at Desmond, then set the briefcase on the table with a quiet click. "Good morning," he said. Desmond stared at his nephew as though a ghost had walked into the room. "Isaiah, what is this? You are a kid. You cannot audit a corporation this size." Isaiah opened the case and placed his credentials beside the charter. "I meet every qualification listed in Article 4, Section 12, he said. "As of this morning, I am the independent transition auditor for Montgomery National Logistics." The boardroom erupted. Robert demanded a recess. Another director objected to family involvement. Desmond said nothing. His eyes had moved to Isaiah's laptop, and for the first time that morning I saw genuine fear rather than anger. My lawyer finally stood. "The appointment is valid," he said, cutting through the noise. "The charter gives Mrs. Montgomery sole discretion, and Mr. Montgomery meets the stated qualifications. Interfering with the audit, deleting records, altering access permissions, or obstructing preservation requests will be documented as a governance violation and referred as required." The room quieted faster than any gavel could have managed. Directors who had been loudly supporting Desmond lowered their eyes to their folders. Nobody wanted his family coup badly enough to have his own messages examined. Desmond, however, was not ready to surrender. He pulled out his phone and fired off a text. A moment later, the boardroom monitor flashed as someone in information technology attempted to change Isaiah's permissions. Isaiah glanced at the screen, typed twice, and calmly said, "That request has been logged and blocked. Whoever submitted it should preserve the device used to make it." Desmond's jaw tightened. He turned toward the general counsel, but counsel pretended to be reading. He looked to Robert, who suddenly became fascinated with his coffee. The coalition that had seemed solid 10 minutes earlier had begun to crack because none of them knew how much Isaiah could see. "Isaiah has unrestricted audit access to the records covered by the transition clause," I said. "He will review them without interrupting ordinary freight operations. Anyone who tries to interfere will create a record of that interference." I let my eyes rest on Desmond. His shirt collar was darkening with sweat. He had wanted my chair because he believed the chair was power. Now he was discovering that power also lived in rules, logs, signatures, and people willing to follow procedures when the room became uncomfortable. "I accept the medical findings for purposes of this transition," I said. "I resign as Chief Executive Officer. The company is yours, Desmond. Good luck managing it." I turned before he could answer. Behind me, I heard Isaiah open the metal briefcase and place his laptop beside the stack of board papers. Desmond had won the title he wanted. What he had not won was the freedom to erase what came before it. The corridor outside the boardroom was almost silent. My heels clicked against the stone as I walked toward the private elevators. For the first time that morning, I allowed myself to think about Nathaniel. I remembered us at our kitchen table 30 years earlier, long before the 50th floor, when the company owned more debt than equipment and every contract mattered. He had insisted that no executive, not even one of us, should be able to seize emergency control without leaving a trail. "Wealth attracts parasites," he used to say, "and the dangerous ones rarely arrive looking dangerous." I had laughed then and accused him of being dramatic. Standing outside that elevator, I wished he had been wrong. My phone vibrated. Isaiah had sent a single message: "Access granted. Preservation notices active." I read it twice. Another message followed 30 seconds later. "Desmond tried to have IT revoke my credentials. Attempt logged." I closed my eyes for a moment, not from exhaustion, but from grief. My son was still trying to win by making evidence disappear rather than by explaining it. The elevator opened. As I descended, more updates arrived. Isaiah had mirrored the executive ledger's locked deletion protocols and instructed accounting to preserve original timestamps. He was not announcing discoveries. He was building a chain that could survive questions later. That distinction mattered. A dramatic accusation might frighten Desmond for an afternoon. Preserved evidence could outlive every excuse he invented. On the ground floor, employees moved through the lobby carrying coffee tablets, manifests, and safety folders. None of them looked panicked. Trucks were still moving. Dispatch boards were still active. The company was not frozen. Only Desmond's ability to reach into protected accounts without another set of eyes had been restricted. I walked past the reception desk and into the Atlanta humidity. Thomas was waiting beside the sedan, holding the rear door. "Where to now, Mrs. Montgomery?" he asked. I slid into the back seat and looked once at the glass tower behind us. "Take me to the Ritz, Thomas," I said, "and make sure no one follows us. I have a lunch date to arrange." As the sedan pulled away, calls began arriving almost immediately. Robert Franklin called first. I let it ring. The head of operations called next, followed by 2 directors who had voted with Desmond less than an hour earlier. Their sudden concern did not impress me. I asked Thomas to silence the phone and watched warehouses, office towers, and construction cranes move past the tinted glass. Isaiah sent updates instead. Routine payroll was untouched. Fuel purchases were untouched. Vendor payments below the protected threshold were moving normally. He had even sent a short notice to regional managers explaining that the transition audit would not change shipping schedules. Desmond would later tell anyone who listened that I had sabotaged operations, but the company itself was disproving him minute by minute. The only thing he could not do was reach behind the curtain. That was why his messages grew more frantic. One voicemail began with the controlled language of an executive and ended with the anger of a cornered son. He accused me of humiliating him. He said Isaiah was poisoning the board against him. Then, without irony, he said family problems should remain private. I listened to that sentence twice. He had used a doctor, a court filing, a board vote, and moving trucks to push me out of my own life. Yet privacy became sacred the moment scrutiny turned toward him. I deleted the message. I did not need to argue with him. I needed him impatient. I needed him convinced that the audit was closing in and that only one decisive signature could restore the control he believed he deserved. By the time we reached the Ritz, the shape of my next move was clear. Desmond still wanted the house. Valerie wanted it even more. Their greed had already made them careless once. I intended to give it another opportunity. In the suite, I spread a clean legal pad across the dining table and wrote 3 words at the top, "What he wants." Underneath, I listed the House majority control, access speed, and public victory. Then I wrote a second heading, "What he fears." Exposure, delay, losing Valerie, looking weak in front of the board. The exercise was something Nathaniel and I used during negotiations. People often tell you what they value through their demands, but they reveal what controls them through the things they cannot tolerate. Desmond could tolerate debt, dishonesty, and risk. What he could not tolerate was waiting while someone else examined his choices. That was the pressure point. Harrison Caldwell, my real estate attorney, called and asked whether I was certain I wanted to proceed with an asset assumption agreement rather than challenge the forged papers immediately. I told him yes, but only if every step could withstand later scrutiny. No tricks with missing pages, no altered copies, no rushed notary who could be accused of misconduct. The document had to be readable, complete, and voluntary. Desmond had to have the chance to call counsel and choose not to. Harrison was silent for a few seconds before saying he understood. I could hear typing begin on his end. While he drafted, I opened Valerie's unanswered messages. She had sent photographs of fabric samples, a chandelier, and a marble kitchen island, apparently assuming I would admire the renovations she planned for the home she had not yet legally acquired. One message was simply a picture of my bedroom with a red circle around the wall and the words, "This will come down." I stared at it until my anger became useful again. Then I called the Piedmont Driving Club and reserved a private dining room for noon the next day. I asked for the room near the fireplace, the one with doors thick enough to keep curious ears outside. Desmond thought the audit was closing a trap around him. He was right about that. He was wrong about where the next door would appear. At the hotel that afternoon, Isaiah finally called instead of texting. He kept his voice low because Desmond was still moving between offices on the executive floor. The audit itself had become almost secondary to watching my son react to it. Desmond had summoned the information technology director twice, demanded a list of everyone who could see his executive folders, and ordered an assistant to locate old paper files that had not been opened in years. Each instruction created another witness. Isaiah told me one accounting manager had quietly asked whether she should copy a set of vendor invoices before anyone removed them. Another employee had admitted that Desmond's office had pressured her to change the description on a transfer weeks earlier. Fear was changing sides. People who had stayed silent because Desmond held the title were beginning to understand that the title no longer guaranteed control of the record. I told Isaiah not to push anyone into dramatic statements. Take what they volunteer, preserve what exists, and let them go back to work, I said. We are not building a mob. We are building a timeline. He laughed softly and said, Nathaniel used to tell him the same thing when teaching him chess. Do not chase the king so hard that you lose the board. The memory made my throat tighten. Before hanging up, Isaiah added one more detail. Desmond had asked 3 different people whether I had contacted my real estate attorney. That told me he was thinking about the house as much as the company. Good, I said. Let him. When the call ended, I stood at the window looking down at Atlanta traffic and felt the strategy simplify itself. I did not need to invent new pressure. Desmond was creating pressure every time he tried to outrun the consequences of the last decision. My job was to place one clear choice in front of him and then stay out of the way. My phone rang. It was Valerie. I let it ring. She was probably calling to gloat about the moving trucks or to tell me she had already picked out new wallpaper for my office. She had no idea that her husband was currently sitting in a boardroom watching his life collapse line by line on a computer screen. She had no idea that the high society lifestyle she loved to flaunt was about to evaporate. I leaned my head back against the leather seat and watched the city blur past the tinted windows. I felt a profound sense of calm. Society expects older women to quietly fade away when challenged by the younger generation. They expect us to surrender our power because our joints ache or our hair turns gray. They mistake our patience for weakness. Desmond mistook my silence for dementia. He thought a piece of paper signed by a corrupt doctor could erase 40 years of my relentless ambition. He was about to learn a very painful lesson about the difference between a title and actual power. He wanted to be the king of Montgomery National Logistics. He wanted to sit at the head of the table. He was about to find out that the crown he stole was incredibly heavy and the throne was rigged to explode. The private dining room at the Piedmont Driving Club smelled of lemon polish and aged leather. I arrived a full hour before our scheduled lunch to prepare my battlefield. I sat in a high-backed chair near the fireplace and pulled a small mirror from my purse. I wiped away the crimson lipstick I had worn in the boardroom the previous morning. I removed my pearl earrings and placed them in my bag. I unfastened the top button of my silk blouse and let my posture slump forward just a fraction of an inch. I practiced keeping my eyes slightly vacant and letting my hands tremble against the white tablecloth. I had to look like a woman whose spirit had been entirely broken by a medical diagnosis. I had to look like a mother who had finally surrendered to the inevitable passing of time. The heavy oak doors swung open exactly at noon. Valerie walked in first, carrying 3 large shopping bags from high-end designer boutiques. She wore a bright yellow sundress that was entirely too informal for the setting. Desmond followed closely behind her. He looked terrible. His skin was pale and dark circles hung heavily under his eyes. Isaiah had been doing his job perfectly. The forensic audit was starving Desmond of the stolen cash he desperately needed to maintain his illusions. Valerie dropped her shopping bags onto an empty chair with a loud thud. She did not say hello. She immediately began complaining about the traffic on Peachtree Road and how the valet had parked her new imported sports car too close to a delivery van. She pulled out her chair and sat down, signaling for a waiter, before Desmond even had a chance to take off his suit jacket. Desmond sat across from me. He folded his hands on the table and stared at my face. He was looking for signs of a trap. I was looking for the fierce businesswoman who had cornered him in the foyer of my home. I did not give him anything. I picked up my water glass with both hands, allowing the ice to rattle loudly against the crystal. I spilled a few drops onto the pristine tablecloth. I quickly grabbed a napkin and dabbed at the spill, muttering an apology to the empty air. Desmond relaxed his shoulders. He saw exactly what he wanted to see. He saw a frail, confused elder losing her grip on reality. "Mom, we appreciate you inviting us to lunch," Desmond said, using the same careful, patronizing tone he had used when he handed me the medical directive. "We know the last few days have been a difficult adjustment." I gave him the version of me I had prepared before they arrived. Slower movements, softer answers, no sharp interruptions. "Everything is moving quickly," I said. "I am trying to accept that." Valerie laughed and tore a bread roll in half. "Accepting reality is healthy, Beatrice. You should be grateful we stepped in before something truly embarrassing happened." Desmond shot her a warning look, but she ignored it. He leaned toward me instead. "We need to talk about Isaiah. The audit is creating unnecessary friction. People are nervous. He is asking questions that make normal business look suspicious. I said nothing at first. I let him fill the silence. He complained about delayed approvals, questioned Isaiah's experience, and insisted that a family member should not have access to executive records. Each complaint contradicted the last. If the audit had found nothing, it should not have frightened him. If it was merely inconvenient, he would not have needed me to end it immediately. He kept glancing at his phone face down beside the plate. Twice it vibrated. Twice he ignored it. On the third vibration, he turned it over and read the screen. The muscles along his jaw tightened. Whatever Isaiah's team was doing at headquarters, Desmond could feel it from across the city. "You can stop this, Mom," he said more quietly. "Sign an override. Let me manage the transition the way it needs to be managed." I lifted my water glass and took a small sip. "Nathaniel always believed clean books protect good executives," I said. Desmond's expression hardened. "Nathaniel is dead." The words came out louder than he intended. A waiter near the sideboard paused. Valerie looked at him. Desmond immediately lowered his voice, but the polished calm was gone. I watched him press his fingertips into the tablecloth. He was no longer trying to persuade me. He was trying not to panic in front of his wife. That was far more useful. Valerie rescued him without realizing it. She rolled her eyes, ordered an expensive bottle of champagne, and announced that she had finalized the guest list for Saturday's housewarming party. More than 200 people, she said. A live jazz band by the pool imported caviar, a designer lighting installation, and fireworks after the speeches. She had invited politicians, developers, 2 local television personalities, and women from every social club that had ever made her wait for membership. "You are throwing a party at my house," I said. "Our house," she corrected. She said it with such certainty that Desmond actually looked uncomfortable. Valerie continued talking, describing which walls would be opened, which paintings would disappear, and how my late husband's study would become a cocktail room, because in her words, old offices made houses feel depressing. I stopped looking at her and looked at my son. He knew that room. He knew Nathaniel had taught him to read balance sheets at that desk. He knew the scratches on the lower drawer came from the toy trucks he pushed across the floor as a child. I gave him every opportunity to object without asking him to. He did not. Instead, he cleared his throat and said, "Valerie is right, that the property needs to reflect a new generation." Something inside me settled. I no longer needed to wonder whether shame might reach him before consequences did. Valerie lifted her champagne as though she had already won. "I need the deed situation cleaned up today," she said. "The event planner says some permits require the current property holder's signature." Desmond looked at her sharply. "Val, we discussed this." She waved him off. Then she turned to me. "Surely you do not want lawyers fighting over a house while your doctors are telling you to rest." The sentence hung there. I lowered my eyes for a moment, not because I was wounded, but because I did not want them to see how perfectly they had walked toward the opening I had prepared. When I looked up again, I said, "Perhaps you are right." Desmond stopped breathing for half a beat. Valerie smiled. I reached beside my chair and lifted the leather briefcase onto the table. The sound of the brass clasps opening was small, but both of them watched my hands. I removed a thick document printed on cream legal stock and placed it between the wine glasses. Desmond did not touch it immediately. Valerie did. She pulled it closer far enough to read the title, Deed Transfer and Asset Assumption Agreement. Her eyes widened. "For the house?" she asked. "Yes," I said. I told them I was tired of probate motions, capacity hearings, and strangers discussing my mind as if I were not in the room. I said I would rather settle the property question privately. Every word was true enough to sound effortless. Desmond's suspicion returned. "You fought us at the house. You called the police. You used the charter against me yesterday, and now you are giving me the estate." I met his eyes. "I am ending a fight, Desmond. What you do with what comes after it is your responsibility." That answer bothered him because it did not sound like surrender, but Valerie was already turning pages. She kept stopping at photographs attached to the property schedule and whispering about the pool, the guest wing, the gardens. Desmond took the document from her and read the first page carefully. I watched his eyes move line by line. I did not rush him. I did not explain what he was reading. The entire point of the meeting was that the paper had to speak for itself. At the bottom of the first section, he looked up. "This transfers title immediately after recording." "Yes. And your remaining voting position?" he asked. I tapped the next section. "There is a temporary voting proxy tied to the transition." His attention sharpened. Across the table, Valerie smiled as though I had just placed a crown in front of him. For the first time since entering the room, Desmond forgot to pretend I was fragile. He looked at me as one negotiator looks at another, and I saw desperation fighting greed behind his eyes. The voting proxy was what broke his caution. Desmond read that section twice. It gave him the temporary majority position he had been demanding during the transition, enough to call meetings, challenge Isaiah's appointment, and test the limits of the charter. I could almost hear the calculations running behind his eyes. He imagined returning to headquarters that afternoon, summoning the board, and undoing the restrictions that had made him sweat through his collar. Valerie understood only that more control meant more money. She leaned over his shoulder and whispered, "Sign it." Desmond ignored her. "There is a catch," he said. "There is always a catch with you." I rested my hands in my lap. "Then read it," I said. The answer surprised him. He had expected reassurance. Instead, I nodded toward the document. "Take your time. Call whoever you need to call." For several seconds, he did exactly what a sensible man should have done. He turned pages. He stopped at definitions. He traced a paragraph with his finger. Then his phone buzzed again. This time he read the message and went pale. He stood abruptly and walked 3 steps away from the table before answering in a whisper. I could not hear every word, but I heard Isaiah's name access, and no, absolutely not. Valerie's expression changed from triumph to annoyance. When Desmond returned, the careful reading was over. He flipped to the voting section again, as if the other pages had ceased to matter. "If I control the votes, I can deal with the audit," he said, more to himself than to me. I said nothing. He looked at the signature page, then at his phone. The pressure was doing what pressure always does to careless people, narrowing the world until the thing directly in front of them looked like the only thing that mattered. He reached inside his jacket. For one hopeful second, I thought he was taking out a pen. Instead, he took out his phone. "I am calling counsel," he said. Valerie's head snapped toward him. That was the moment the plan could still have failed, and I was prepared to let it fail. If Desmond's attorney told him not to sign, I would leave with the document and pursue another route. The evidence against him would not disappear. I would not create a victory that depended on preventing legal advice. Valerie, however, had no patience for caution. She grabbed his wrist before the call connected. "Are you serious?" she hissed. "We need the deed today. The permits, the vendors, the party. Everything depends on it." Desmond pulled his arm away. "This is a major agreement." "Exactly," Valerie said. "And she is sitting here offering you exactly what you have been fighting for. If you send this to lawyers, they will argue for days, and then she might change her mind." I remained still and watched them turn on each other. Desmond said he was trying to protect them. Valerie accused him of being afraid. He reminded her that one mistake could cost them everything. She laughed at him. "One mistake," she said. "The mistake would be walking away from a house like this because you are scared of paperwork." Desmond looked at me as if expecting me to intervene. I did not. The role I had established when they arrived required no additional performance. I simply sat quietly, allowing his own assumptions to do the work. He looked back at the document. His phone vibrated again. He glanced at the screen and swore under his breath. Then he canceled the call. Valerie's shoulders relaxed. Mine did not. I knew the choice he was making, and I wanted no confusion later about whose choice it had been. "You can still have counsel review it," I said. The words startled both of them. Desmond stared at me. Valerie immediately protested, but I held up a hand. "This is your decision. Read it or do not. Sign it or do not." Desmond's pride took the sentence as a challenge. He put the phone face down, pulled a gold fountain pen from his breast pocket and said, "Do you have a notary?" "I already thought of that," I said, pulling a second document from my briefcase. "I brought a notary from my team. She is waiting in the lobby. I can text her to come in and witness the signatures right now." Desmond nodded eagerly. "Do it." I sent a quick text message. 30 seconds later, a licensed notary public walked into the private dining room. She was a professional woman who had worked with my firm for years. She carried her official stamp and a logbook. She did not ask questions. She simply placed her equipment on the table and waited. Desmond flipped to the final page of the asset assumption agreement. He did not read the dense paragraphs of legal text on the preceding pages. He did not read the section detailing the transfer of corporate liabilities. He only saw the blank line waiting for his signature. He only saw the $12 million mansion and the keys to the corporate kingdom. He uncapped his gold pen. The metal flashed under the chandelier light. He signed his name with a swift, arrogant flourish. Valerie let out a breath she had been holding and clapped her hands together. "We did it," she whispered, her eyes shining with tears of absolute greed. "We actually did it." The notary stepped forward and stamped the document with a loud, heavy thud. She signed her own name, confirming the legal transfer of the assets and the liabilities. She handed one copy to Desmond and slid the original copy across the table to me. I picked up the document. I felt the heavy paper between my fingers. I looked at my son's signature. The ink was still drying. The trap was sealed. There was no going back. There was no escape. Desmond smiled at me, a genuine, relaxed smile for the first time in months. "Thank you, Mom," he said, sliding his copy into his leather briefcase. "I know this was hard for you, but you made the right choice. I promise we will take good care of the house. You can come visit the gardens whenever you want, assuming the nurses at your new facility let you take day trips." Valerie stood up, gathering her shopping bags. "Come on, Desmond. We have to go to the city planning office to get those event permits signed. I need to call the caterer and upgrade the champagne order." They did not stay for lunch. They gathered the signed copy, the permit documents Valerie had brought with her and her shopping bags, then hurried out of the private dining room, arguing about whether to go first to the city office or the event planner. The door closed behind them. For several seconds I sat exactly where I had been, listening to the fading rhythm of Valerie's heels. The waiter entered with menus and looked at the empty chairs. "Will your guests be returning, ma'am?" "No," I said. "But I will stay." I ordered prime rib and a glass of red wine, then opened the document sleeve and checked the signatures once more. Desmond's was dark and unmistakable. The notary's stamp was clean. The time in her log matched the security system in the club. I photographed the pages and sent the encrypted copies to Harrison and Isaiah. My message to Isaiah contained only 4 words. He signed, "Proceed carefully." His answer came back almost immediately. "Understood. Records preserved. Counsel notified." I put the phone down. I did not need to recite to myself what the signature meant. Isaiah and I had already examined that problem at the hotel. What mattered now was sequence. Desmond had been offered time. He had considered calling an attorney. I had expressly told him he still could. He chose speed. That fact would become as important as any paragraph in the agreement once he began claiming betrayal. I ate slowly and watched rain clouds gathering beyond the windows. Somewhere across the city, Desmond was probably imagining his return to the boardroom. Somewhere else, Valerie was ordering more champagne. They believed the most dangerous part of the week was behind them. I knew it was only beginning. Before leaving the club, I asked the notary to make a certified copy of her log entry and seal it separately. I also requested the club preserve the hallway camera footage showing Desmond entering and leaving under his own power, speaking normally, carrying his own briefcase and using his phone. Those details sounded almost painfully ordinary, which was exactly why I wanted them. Desmond's strategy from the beginning had been to turn ordinary facts into a story about my incapacity. I would not give him room to reverse the tactic and claim his own signature had been taken from a confused or coerced man. Harrison called while I waited. He confirmed that the lender's counsel had received notice that a signed substitution package was being transmitted for review. I did not ask him to repeat the legal mechanics. We had already spent hours on them. Instead, I asked one question. "Is the company protected if every signature is accepted as represented?" "Yes," he said. "Then protect the company," I replied. "Nothing else matters." That answer surprised even me. Earlier in the week, I had wanted Desmond to feel every ounce of fear he had tried to place on me. I still wanted consequences, but the audit had reminded me that revenge could not become the objective. Thousands of people depended on Montgomery National Logistics. Drivers had mortgages. Warehouse employees had children in school. Dispatchers were planning retirement. If my desire to punish my son damaged those people, I would become another version of the selfish executive I despised. So I gave Harrison a final instruction: no theatrics that endangered operations, no invented deadlines, no shortcuts. Let Desmond's own choices carry the weight. When the sealed copy arrived, I placed it beside the original and finally allowed myself to finish my wine. Valerie wanted a spectacular party. Desmond wanted a spectacular return to power. I would not stop either of them. I would simply make sure the truth arrived before the applause ended. 2 nights earlier, Harrison Caldwell had made me sit across from him for nearly an hour without discussing strategy at all. He wanted facts. He asked where I was when the disputed loan was signed, who controlled the digital notary credentials, which trust documents governed the mansion, and whether Desmond had ever received written authority to pledge protected property. Isaiah answered with timestamps, server logs, access records, and copies of the governing instruments. Harrison interrupted him constantly. "Prove that. Show me the original. Who created this file? Who had custody after export?" At first his questions irritated me. Then I understood what he was doing. He was treating our evidence as if Desmond's best attorney were already in the room. Anger could wait. The record had to survive. Harrison finally pushed the laptop away and looked at me. "What do you actually want, Beatrice?" he asked. "Not what you want him to feel. What outcome do you want?" I looked toward the storm pressing against the windows. "I want the company safe. I want the house out of his scheme. I want the false medical record exposed. And I want every consequence he faces to come from something he chose, not something we fabricated." Harrison nodded once. "Good," he said. "Then we can work." He warned me that there was no magical phrase a lawyer could hide in a deed and use to rewrite reality. The lender had rights. The trust had rights. Desmond had rights. Any restructuring would need consent, clear documentation, and a signature that could withstand a later challenge. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. A clever trick might make a satisfying story for one night. A clean record would protect my company for years. The work that followed was less dramatic than revenge and far more demanding. Harrison contacted Apex through a confidential legal channel and disclosed enough of the forged authorization problem to force their lawyers to confront the weakness in the original collateral package. He did not threaten them. He did not beg them. He told them that if they wanted an enforceable path forward, every party would need to document a lawful replacement arrangement. Their counsel responded within hours. They cared about recovering money, not about Desmond's marriage or my humiliation. That cold self-interest made them predictable. Harrison negotiated safeguards around the company, while Isaiah supplied certified records showing which assets were protected by the trust and which obligations Desmond had personally initiated. I sat at the end of the conference table listening to attorneys argue over definitions, notices, warranties, and evidence. There was no single dramatic moment when the trap appeared. It was built the way Nathaniel had built warehouses, one measured piece at a time. Near midnight, Harrison slid a draft toward me. "Read every page," he said. I did. I asked questions. I made him rewrite 2 sentences that sounded deliberately obscure. If Desmond later signed the agreement, I wanted the consequence to come from his refusal to read, not from language designed to be invisible. Isaiah watched me initial the changes. "Nana," he said, "if he calls his lawyer, this probably ends." "I know," I replied. "Then he gets to keep that choice." Isaiah studied me for a moment and nodded. That was the line I refused to cross. Desmond had taken away my choices with false medical claims. I would not prove I was stronger by doing the same thing to him. I would put the door in front of him. Whether he walked through it would be his decision. By 1 a.m, the final packet was ready. Harrison had prepared the property transfer, the temporary voting proxy, the lender acknowledgments, and the notices required if the agreement was executed. He placed colored tabs beside every signature line, but refused to mark the substantive provisions, because Desmond needed to read the document as a whole. The notary who would attend lunch received separate instructions: verify identity, confirm willingness, record the time, and stop immediately if either signer appeared impaired or uncertain. I appreciated the irony. My son had built his attack around a false claim that I could not understand my own affairs. My response would be documented proof that he understood his. Before we left, Harrison looked at me over his glasses. "You realize this can still become ugly even if it works. He may accuse you publicly. He may sue. He may claim family pressure." I folded the packet into my briefcase. "Then we preserve the facts and answer the claims," I said. He asked whether I was afraid of seeing Desmond destroyed. That question followed me into the elevator. I was not afraid of consequences for him. I was afraid of what his destruction meant about the son I thought I had raised. There was a difference. By the time the elevator reached the lobby, the storm had broken, and the streets shone black under the rain. Isaiah walked beside me carrying the encrypted drive. Neither of us spoke until Thomas opened the car door. Then Isaiah said, "He may still surprise us and read it." I looked back at the tower where Harrison's lights were still burning. "I hope he does," I said. I meant it. A part of me still wanted one final piece of evidence that Desmond could choose caution over greed. The next day at the Piedmont Driving Club, he gave me the answer. I told Harrison to print the document. I watched the heavy cream-colored paper slide out of the printer, knowing that each page was a nail in my son's financial coffin. I signed my portion of the agreement and handed it to Isaiah to place in his secure leather portfolio. We had forged the poison pill. All I had to do was serve it on a silver platter. The memory faded, and I found myself back in the quiet elegance of the private dining room at the Piedmont Driving Club. I smoothed my hand over the crisp white tablecloth and took another slow breath. Desmond had swallowed the pill. He had signed his name on the dotted line with a gold fountain pen, thinking he had just outsmarted his tired old mother. He had no idea the venom was already working its way through his financial veins. My secure cell phone chimed softly from inside my purse. I pulled it out and opened a new encrypted message from Isaiah. The message was long and detailed, filled with the final pieces of forensic data he had uncovered while digging through Valerie's private banking records. Isaiah had traced the $50,000 monthly consulting fees Desmond had been funneling to his wife. At first, we assumed Valerie was just wasting the stolen corporate funds on exotic vacations and expensive spa treatments. But Isaiah had dug much deeper into the digital routing numbers. He discovered that Valerie was not just a greedy woman with a shopping addiction. She was actively participating in a highly illegal black market operation. Isaiah explained in his message that Valerie had been wiring massive amounts of cash to an unlisted account in Eastern Europe. She was using a proxy buyer to purchase stolen luxury designer goods, exclusive jewelry, rare handbags, and imported watches that had been flagged by international customs agencies. She was having these stolen items quietly smuggled into the country and then using them to bribe her way into the most elite social circles in Atlanta. She had gifted a stolen diamond tennis bracelet to the wife of a prominent city councilman. She had given a black market designer handbag to the chairwoman of the local country club admission board. Valerie was literally buying her high society reputation using stolen corporate funds to distribute illegal merchandise to local politicians. I read the message twice to ensure I fully comprehended the sheer magnitude of her arrogance. Valerie thought she was a brilliant social climber. She thought she could mock my age, dismiss my legacy, and build her own fabulous life using my money. She did not realize she had just handed me the final piece of ammunition I needed to completely obliterate her reputation in front of the very people she was trying to impress. Isaiah finished his message with one final update. He confirmed that he had officially transmitted the signed asset assumption agreement to the legal department at Apex Heritage Capital. The private equity firm now possessed the legally binding document proving Desmond had personally guaranteed the $18 million debt. The collection executives at Apex Heritage were notoriously aggressive. They did not send polite warning letters through the mail. When $18 million was on the line, they sent specialized recovery agents to secure their investments in person. I looked at the clock on the dining room wall. It was early Friday afternoon. Valerie was currently rushing around the city, ordering expensive caviar and arranging for live jazz musicians to perform at my house. She was planning to host a lavish housewarming party the following evening to celebrate her newly stolen mansion. She had invited over 200 guests, including local politicians, wealthy real estate developers, and influential media figures. She wanted the entire city of Atlanta to watch her step into my shoes and claim my throne. I smiled a slow, genuine smile that reached all the way to my eyes. I replied to Isaiah's message. I told him to monitor the private equity firm's dispatch logs. I told him to make sure his suit was pressed and his shoes were shined. Valerie wanted to throw the most unforgettable social event of the season. She wanted to stand in the grand foyer of my beautiful home and toast to her brilliant future. She was going to get exactly what she wanted. I was not going to stop her party. I was going to let her fill my house with the most powerful people in the state. I was going to let her pour the expensive champagne and listen to the beautiful music. And then I was going to crash her perfect celebration and watch her entire world burn to the ground. On Saturday morning, I spoke with Clara for the first time since leaving the estate. I did not ask her to spy on anyone, and I did not need her to. She had called because Valerie had ordered the household staff to treat the party as if a royal family were arriving. Clara's voice was calm, but I heard the insult underneath it when she told me Francine had begun referring to longtime employees as temporary help. I told Clara that no one was required to endure abuse for the sake of my plan. Any employee who wanted to leave could leave with full pay. Clara gave a short laugh and said she had worked beside me for 25 years and was not about to abandon the house because an overdressed guest had discovered a wine list. I trusted her judgment, but I reminded her of one rule when the confrontation began. The staff were to move away from the foyer and let the lawyers' collection team and law enforcement officers handle their own work. Isaiah spent the afternoon at a secure location, finishing the evidence package for federal investigators. He had already preserved the server logs and financial records, but the medical fraud evidence required a separate chain of custody. The payment to Dr. Sterling, the appointment records, the messages between Desmond and the doctor's office, and the metadata from the forged directive were arranged in chronological order. Isaiah wanted the agents to see the same thing we had seen in the hotel. Not a family disagreement, but a coordinated scheme. By early evening, he confirmed that the packet had been delivered and that investigators had enough to act on their own timetable. I did not ask them to arrest Desmond at the party. That decision belonged to them. I only knew the evidence was no longer trapped inside our family. Harrison handled the civil side. Apex acknowledged receipt of the signed assumption agreement. ITE's counsel confirmed the lender-approved substitution, and their recovery division began preparing the emergency attachment request triggered by the change in collateral and the documented risk that assets would disappear. The timing of their arrival was theirs, but Isaiah could see the dispatch notices once Apex opened the recovery file. That was why I knew to check Nathaniel's watch. I dressed slowly that evening. The emerald gown was not chosen because I wanted to look glamorous. I chose it because Valerie had spent days telling people I was confused, diminished, and ready to disappear. I wanted the first thing every witness saw to contradict that story before I said a word. I pinned my hair, fastened Nathaniel's watch, and looked at myself in the mirror. I did not see the Iron Widow, the nickname newspapers and competitors liked to use. I saw a 68-year-old woman who had buried her husband, raised a son, built a company, and learned that love does not require surrendering judgment. Then Thomas opened the car door, and we drove toward the lights of my own house. The Buckhead mansion was ablaze with light. From my vantage point in the back of my idling sedan down the street, I could see the glow of the crystal chandeliers spilling out onto the manicured front lawn. Valerie had truly outdone herself in her desperate quest to be crowned the new queen of Atlanta high society. The long circular driveway was jammed with imported luxury vehicles. Valets in crisp white jackets were sprinting back and forth, tossing keys to one another. I rolled down my tinted window just enough to let the warm night air inside. A live jazz band was set up on the rear terrace, playing a smooth, brassy tune that drifted over the tall iron gates. It sounded expensive. It sounded like stolen money. I checked the reflection in my compact mirror. I was wearing a custom-tailored emerald green gown that draped perfectly across my shoulders. Around my neck sat a vintage gold collar necklace, but the most important piece of jewelry I wore was fastened to my left wrist. It was Nathaniel's heavy diamond-encrusted platinum timepiece. He used to wear it to every major corporate acquisition meeting. It was heavy and cold and felt exactly like armor. I checked the dial. The timing had to be absolutely flawless. Inside my home, Valerie was holding court in the grand foyer. She wore a sparkling silver cocktail dress that caught the light every time she moved her arms. She was floating between groups of city council members, local real estate developers, and media influencers, handing out flutes of imported champagne. She laughed loudly, throwing her head back and touching the arm of a prominent state senator. She was wearing the stolen diamond tennis bracelet Isaiah had tracked on the digital ledger. She was literally draped in federal wire fraud, and she thought she looked like royalty. Her mother, Francine, was standing near the entrance to the formal dining room. Francine was a woman who had never possessed a dime of her own money, but walked around with her nose pointed at the ceiling the moment her daughter married into my family. She was currently holding an empty martini glass and looking around with a sneer of deep annoyance. Emma's Clara was navigating through the dense crowd, carrying a heavy silver tray of appetizers. Clara had been the head housekeeper for our family for 25 years. In our culture, a woman like Clara is not just an employee. She is an elder. She had helped me raise Desmond. She had cooked the meals we ate when we were staying up late building the company. She commanded respect. but Francine did not know anything about respect. Francine snapped her fingers directly in Clara's face. The sharp, insulting sound cut through the low murmur of the nearby guests. Clara stopped and turned her expression perfectly stoic. Francine shoved her empty martini glass onto the tray of appetizers, completely ruining a row of delicate crab blinis. She told Clara to take the trash to the kitchen and fetch her a fresh drink with 2 olives. She did not say please. She flicked her wrist as if shooing away a stray dog. Clara did not flinch. She simply looked at Francine with the quiet, dignified patience of a woman who knows her own worth. She nodded once, balanced the heavy tray, and turned toward the kitchen. Valerie noticed the interaction from across the room. Instead of apologizing for her mother's atrocious behavior, Valerie just laughed and went back to charming the state senator. They were treating my home like a playground and my people like props. I put my compact mirror away and tapped the glass partition dividing the front seat of the sedan. I told Thomas it was time to go. The heavy car glided forward smoothly, turning into the main entrance of the estate. A valet immediately jogged up to my window holding a glowing red wand to stop the vehicle. He started to say that the driveway was full and only invited guests were allowed past the gates. Thomas rolled down his window and gave the young man a single chilling look. The valet recognized Thomas immediately. He swallowed hard, lowered the wand, and backed away quickly, signaling the other attendants to clear a path. Thomas parked the car directly in front of the sweeping marble steps, completely blocking a pristine white sports car. He walked around and opened my door. I stepped out onto the driveway. The humid Georgia air wrapped around me, but I felt entirely cold. I walked up the marble steps, my heels clicking a steady, unhurried rhythm. The heavy oak front doors were pinned wide open to let the evening breeze circulate through the party. I stepped over the threshold and into the bright light of the grand foyer. The reaction was instantaneous. The people nearest to the door turned to look at the new arrival. Conversation simply stopped. The silence spread inward like a wave rippling across a pond. Corporate executives who had known me for decades lowered their drinks. Politicians who had cashed my campaign donation checks took a sudden step backward. The sea of elite guests naturally parted, creating a wide, clear path directly toward the center of the room. I walked through the gap, keeping my chin high. I did not rush. I took my time, letting the emerald fabric of my gown catch the light. I let them see the diamond watch on my wrist. I let them see the absolute, unshakable authority in my posture. Valerie was standing by the grand staircase, handing a glass of wine to a local news anchor. She heard the music falter as the jazz band on the terrace noticed the sudden shift in the crowd's energy. She turned around to see what was happening. The glass slipped from her hand and shattered against the polished hardwood floor. Red wine splashed across her expensive silver shoes. She stared at me, her jaw literally dropping open. The smug, confident hostess evaporated in a single second, replaced by a terrified little girl. She looked wildly around the room, searching for Desmond, but he was nowhere to be seen. He was probably hiding in the back study, trying to figure out why his corporate credit cards were suddenly declining. Valerie quickly recovered her composure, or at least she tried to. She plastered a tight, frantic smile on her face and marched toward me. She waved frantically at 2 large men standing near the coat check room. They were private security guards she had hired for the evening. They wore black suits and earpieces, looking very serious and intimidating. She pointed a shaking finger at me. "Get her out of here!" She hissed, her voice high and tight with panic. "Grab her arms and escort her outside immediately." The 2 large men stepped forward, but they hesitated when they saw my face. They knew exactly who I was. I had employed the security firm they worked for over a decade ago. Valerie noticed their hesitation, and her panic turned into public desperation. She turned to the crowd of wealthy guests, forcing a loud, awkward laugh. "I am so sorry, everyone," she announced, projecting her voice so the politicians could hear. "My mother-in-law has been very sick lately. She suffers from severe dementia. She must have wandered away from her assisted living facility and gotten confused. It is so tragic when the mind goes." She turned back to the guards. "I said remove her. She is a danger to herself. Do not let her cause a scene." I did not break my stride. I walked right past Valerie, completely ignoring her frantic commands. I walked directly to the massive catering table set up along the far wall. A young bartender was standing there, frozen, holding a bottle of vintage champagne. I held out my hand. He quickly placed a crystal flute in my palm and filled it to the brim. I took a slow sip. The champagne was crisp and cold. It tasted like victory. I turned around to face the room. The two security guards were standing awkwardly behind Valerie, unsure of what to do. "Stand down, gentlemen," I said, my voice calm but projecting clearly across the silent foyer. "You know perfectly well I signed the checks for your firm. If either of you takes one step closer to me, you will be looking for a new line of work by tomorrow morning." The two men immediately stopped, stepped backward, and clasped their hands in front of them. They looked at Valerie and shook their heads. They were not going to touch me. Valerie was shaking with rage. The veins in her neck were visibly popping. She stomped her silver heel into the spilled wine. "You do not sign the checks anymore," she screamed, losing whatever remained of her high society facade. "Desmond is the CEO now. We own this house. We have the medical directive. You are crazy and you are trespassing." I took another sip of my champagne. I looked at the state senator standing near the staircase. I looked at the prominent real estate developers gathered by the bar. I made sure every single person in that room was hanging on my next word. "I am not crazy, Valerie," I said smoothly. "I am just deeply disappointed in your taste in party decorations. And I am quite certain your guests are going to be very disappointed when they find out the diamond bracelet you are wearing was smuggled into this country using stolen corporate funds." The state senator's wife, who was wearing a bracelet from the same illicit shipment, instinctively covered her wrist with her hand. Whispers erupted across the room like a swarm of angry bees. People were leaning in, talking behind their hands, staring at Valerie with wide, shocked eyes. Valerie opened her mouth to scream something back at me, but the words never came out. The heavy jazz music playing on the back terrace abruptly cut off. It did not fade out gracefully. It stopped with a loud screech of feedback from the amplifiers, as if someone had just yanked the power cord straight out of the wall. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the entire estate. I raised my left wrist and checked Nathaniel's diamond watch. It was exactly 8:15 in the evening. Isaiah had timed the dispatch logs perfectly. The low, deep rumble of powerful engines vibrated through the floorboards. Bright white headlights swept across the massive front windows, cutting through the darkness of the front lawn. The sheer volume of the vehicles approaching the house was undeniable. The guests near the open front doors began to back away nervously, murmuring to one another. Francine, Valerie's mother, dropped her fresh martini glass. It shattered next to the first one. I stepped forward and looked out through the open mahogany doors. A fleet of 6 matte black sport utility vehicles had just breached the main gate. They were not police cruisers. They did not have flashing red and blue lights. They moved with a terrifying synchronized precision, pulling up to the marble steps and forming a solid barricade across the circular driveway. Thomas had already moved my sedan out of the way, letting the convoy block the entire exit. The heavy doors of the vehicles opened simultaneously. 10 men stepped out into the humid Georgia night. They were dressed in sharp, expensive charcoal suits. They did not look like party guests. They looked like corporate assassins. They carried thick leather briefcases and heavy lockboxes. Their faces were entirely devoid of emotion. They were the collection executives and the asset seizure agents from Apex Heritage Capital. The predatory loan sharks had arrived to collect their $15 million. Valerie stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the grand staircase to keep from falling. She looked at the men marching up the marble steps and then looked at me, her eyes silently begging for an explanation she was not prepared to understand. I smiled, taking one last sip of my champagne. I placed the crystal flute on a side table and adjusted the emerald fabric of my gown. The party was officially over. The execution was about to begin. The 10 men walked into my grand foyer with the synchronized precision of a military strike team. They did not look at the crystal chandeliers or the sweeping marble staircase. They did not look at the elite politicians or the wealthy real estate developers who were staring at them in absolute shock. They moved as a single predatory unit. Their footsteps echoed loudly against the hardwood floor, completely swallowing the last remaining whispers of the party guests. They wore immaculate charcoal suits that looked sharper and more expensive than anything my son had ever purchased. They carried heavy leather briefcases and thick black lockboxes. They spread out across the entryway, forming a solid, impenetrable wall between the party guests and the open front doors. Nobody was going to leave this house until they got exactly what they came for. The man at the front of the formation stopped in the center of the foyer. He was tall, with silver hair perfectly combed back and eyes that looked like polished steel. He did not exude anger or malice. He exuded absolute financial zero. I was the kind of man who liquidated generations of family wealth before his morning coffee. He surveyed the terrified crowd of Atlanta high society with mild boredom. Valerie was practically hyperventilating near the staircase. She looked at the men and then looked at the heavy black vehicles parked outside. She took a step forward, her voice trembling as she tried to salvage her ruined housewarming party. "Excuse me," Valerie said, forcing a high-pitched, nervous laugh. "I think you have the wrong address. This is a private residential event. If you do not leave immediately, I am going to have my security team escort you off the property." The silver-haired man did not even look at her. He simply reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a crisp white envelope. He held it up slightly, letting the bright light of the foyer illuminate the embossed logo on the front. "I am looking for Desmond Montgomery," the man said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that made the entire room hold its breath. "I represent Apex Heritage Capital. We have a time-sensitive financial matter to conclude tonight." At the mention of Apex Heritage Capital, a reaction moved through the businessmen near the bar before Desmond even appeared. One developer lowered his glass. A banker I recognized from a charity board whispered something to his wife and moved closer to the exit. They knew Apex's reputation well enough to understand that 6 black vehicles and a recovery director did not signal a social visit. From the hallway leading to the study came hurried footsteps. Desmond burst into the foyer with his tie loose and his phone clenched in one hand. He had lost the polished expression he wore in board meetings. He looked like a man who had spent the last hour calling people who no longer wanted to answer. "What is going on?" he demanded. Valerie rushed to him and pointed toward the men at the entrance. Desmond followed her finger to the silver-haired executive holding the envelope. The color left his face so quickly that a woman standing beside him instinctively stepped away. "Mr. Montgomery," the executive said, "my name is Richard Sterling. I am Senior Recovery Director for Apex Heritage Capital. We received updated documentation this afternoon concerning your loan and the assets connected to it." Desmond backed into a marble side table. A framed photograph rattled, but did not fall. "There is a mistake," he said. "The payment date is Monday. You cannot come into a private residence and start threatening people at a party." His voice was loud enough for every guest to hear, which was exactly what Valerie had wanted from the evening an audience. Only now the audience was listening to something else. Mr. Sterling did not argue. He nodded toward the lawyer beside him. Desmond looked past them toward the open doors, calculating distance. 2 county civil enforcement officers were visible near the gate beside marked vehicles. Whatever thought of throwing the recovery team out had crossed his mind, disappeared. Valerie gripped his sleeve. "Desmond, fix this," she whispered. He did not look at her. For the first time all evening, he looked directly at me. I raised my champagne glass slightly, not in a toast, but in acknowledgement. The truth had arrived. The lawyer stepped forward and introduced himself as David Vance, Collections Counsel for Apex. He did not give the room a lecture. He held up the certified agreement Desmond had signed at lunch and spoke in plain language. "The company is no longer the party we are pursuing under the replacement arrangement, Mr. Montgomery. You accepted personal responsibility and replacement collateral when you executed this agreement. Our counsel accepted the substitution this afternoon." Desmond stared at the page. "No," he said. Then louder, "No, I signed for the house and the voting rights." Valerie turned on him. "What did you sign?" Vance opened the agreement to the signature page and held it where Desmond could see his own name. "Your attorney may dispute any point he wishes in court," he said. "Tonight we are acting under an emergency preservation order issued after our counsel documented a risk that covered assets could be moved or dissipated." The words were simple enough that even the guests who knew nothing about finance understood the consequence. Desmond had signed something he had not bothered to understand, and the men at the door had arrived because of it. He looked at me with naked hatred. "You set me up." I held his stare. "I told you to read it," I said. "You almost called your lawyer. I told you that you still could." Valerie's face changed as she remembered the lunch. She looked from me to Desmond, and the memory of grabbing his wrist seemed to land on her all at once. Mr. Vance handed the order to one of the civil officers. Richard Sterling gave a small nod to his team. "Begin the inventory," he said. No shouting followed from the recovery men. They simply moved with clipboards, cameras, and numbered tags. The quiet professionalism made the scene more humiliating than any raid could have been. The party had stopped being Valerie's coronation. It had become an accounting. The first numbered tag went onto a sculptural lamp Valerie had purchased only 2 days earlier. The second went onto a pair of boxed speakers stacked near the terrace. Nothing about the process was dramatic, yet the room seemed to shrink around her as each small adhesive label appeared. Guests who had arrived admiring the renovations now stepped away from the furniture as if possession itself were contagious. A television anchor quietly handed her champagne to a waiter and began typing on her phone. The state senator, who had been laughing with Valerie 15 minutes earlier, moved toward the far side of the foyer and started speaking urgently to an aide. Francine stood beside the staircase, clutching her martini glass with both hands, pretending not to know where to look. Valerie tried to stop one of the catalogers from photographing a display case. He did not argue with her. He showed the civil officer the inventory sheet, waited for a nod, and continued. That indifference wounded her more than an insult could have. She was used to dominating rooms through volume and association. Now nobody important wanted to be associated with her. Desmond moved from person to person, searching for an ally. Robert Franklin was not there. The politicians avoided his eyes. A developer he had courted for months actually turned his back when Desmond approached. I watched the collapse happen socially before it happened financially. Their entire performance had depended on other people agreeing to pretend that confidence was competence and spending was wealth. Once doubt entered the room, the illusion had no structure underneath it. Valerie finally looked toward me, and for the first time since she had announced she was moving into my house, there was no contempt in her face. There was fear. I did not smile. I simply remained beside the catering table, while the people she had invited to witness her rise began quietly calculating how quickly they could distance themselves from her fall. The silence in the grand foyer was absolute. The wealthy guests were staring at Desmond as if he had just transformed into a monster right in front of them. The illusion of his success, the fake image of the brilliant young CEO, had been completely shattered. Everyone in the room now knew he was secretly drowning in $18 million of criminal debt. "That is fraud," Desmond screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "My mother set me up. She tricked me into signing that paper. She hid that clause. You have to arrest her. She committed fraud." Mr. Sterling let out a dark, humorless chuckle. "We do not care about your family disputes, Mr. Montgomery. We only care about binding legal signatures. Your signature on this document is verified and authenticated. And because you fundamentally altered the collateral structure of the loan, by removing the corporate guarantee, you triggered an automatic default protocol." Desmond gripped his hair with both hands, pulling hard as his reality collapsed. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice dropping to a terrified whimper. "It means the entire $18 million balance became due and payable the exact second you signed the transfer deed." Mr. Sterling said, his steel eyes narrowing. "You are currently in catastrophic default because the new agreement converted the obligation into a personal guarantee, and our counsel had already documented the risk of asset flight. We obtained an emergency state court writ of attachment this afternoon." Mr. Vance, the lawyer, stepped forward and held up a document bearing the court seal. "We secured an emergency writ authorizing the preservation and attachment of assets identified in the agreement. County civil enforcement officers are stationed at the lower gate. We are not here to negotiate, Mr. Montgomery. We are here to secure property subject to the order." Valerie let out a piercing, completely unhinged scream. She pushed past Desmond and charged toward Mr. Sterling. "You cannot do this!" she shrieked, her face twisted in absolute fury. "This is my house. I just planned this entire party. You cannot take my things. We are rich. My husband is the CEO of a billion-dollar company." Mr. Sterling looked at Valerie as if she were an annoying insect buzzing near his ear. He signaled to the remaining 8 men standing in the barricade line. "Begin the catalog process," Mr. Sterling commanded. "Secure all portable valuables first." The men immediately opened their heavy black lockboxes. They pulled out digital tablets and barcode scanners. They did not ask for permission. They simply marched past the horrified party guests and began systematically dismantling Valerie's dream life. 2 men walked directly to the formal dining room and began placing bright red forfeiture stickers on the antique mahogany furniture. Another man walked to the grand piano in the living room and tagged it. They moved with terrifying speed, documenting every piece of art, every silver tray, and every imported rug. Valerie spun around wildly, watching the men tag her beautiful home. She ran toward one of the agents who was currently inspecting a rare vase on a pedestal. "Stop touching my things!" she yelled, reaching out to grab the agent's arm. The agent turned and looked at her with cold, dead eyes. "Ma'am, this property is being secured under a court-issued writ. Interfering with the process can expose you to contempt or obstruction charges. Step back." Valerie stumbled backward, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. She looked at the elite politicians and the wealthy developers she had invited. She wanted them to save her. She wanted them to step in and use their power to stop this nightmare. But the politicians were already moving toward the side doors, eager to escape the humiliating spectacle before their faces ended up in the local tabloids. The high society friends she had bought with stolen money were abandoning her without a second thought. Mr. Sterling walked up to Valerie and held out his hand. He looked specifically at the sparkling diamond tennis bracelet wrapping around her wrist. "According to the financial ledgers we secured from your husband's accounts, Mr. Sterling said that bracelet was purchased using funds diverted from the corporate treasury. Those funds were supposed to be securing our loan. That makes the jewelry stolen property. Take it off." Valerie's hands flew to her wrist, covering the diamonds. "No," she sobbed. "It is a gift. You cannot have it. Take it off now, or I will have the county civil enforcement officers waiting at the bottom of the hill come up here and arrest you for possession of stolen goods." Mr. Sterling said, his voice completely devoid of patience. Valerie was hyperventilating. Her hands shook violently as she unclasped the beautiful diamond bracelet. She dropped it into Mr. Sterling's outstretched palm. He immediately dropped it into a velvet-lined evidence pouch and handed it to one of his men. "And the keys to the imported sports cars parked in the driveway," Mr. Sterling demanded, turning his attention back to Desmond. "Hand them over." Desmond reached into his pockets with trembling fingers. He pulled out the key fobs for the 2 luxury vehicles he and Valerie had leased using the stolen corporate funds. He placed them in Mr. Sterling's hand without saying a word. "If you look out the window, Mrs. Montgomery," Mr. Sterling said to Valerie, pointing toward the expansive front lawn, "you will see our flatbed tow trucks are already securing the vehicles." Valerie rushed to the massive front window and pressed her face against the glass. Through the darkness, she could see the bright yellow flashing lights of 3 heavy-duty tow trucks at the bottom of the driveway. They were currently lifting her pristine white sports car onto a steel ramp. She let out a guttural, agonizing wail and collapsed onto the floor, crying hysterically into her hands. Her mother, Francine, had already slipped out the back door, leaving her daughter to face the humiliation alone. Desmond stood in the center of the foyer, completely frozen. His expensive suit felt entirely too big for him. His eyes were wide and vacant, watching the collection agents place red stickers on the grand staircase. He had lost the company. He had lost the stolen cash. He was losing the cars, the jewelry, and the very house he thought he had successfully stolen just hours ago. I was $18 million in debt, and he had absolutely no way to pay it back. He slowly turned his head and looked at me. I was standing near the catering table, holding my crystal flute of champagne, perfectly still. I wore the diamond watch his father had given me. I looked at my son, feeling no pity, no remorse, and no hesitation. Desmond's legs finally gave out. He dropped to his knees on the hardwood floor right in front of the remaining party guests. I ignored the stares of the wealthy developers. He ignored the sobbing of his wife. He crawled forward, closing the distance between us until he was looking up at me from the ground. "Mom." Desmond choked out tears streaming down his pale cheeks. "Mom, please." I looked down at him. My expression remained entirely impassive. "You have the money, Mom," Desmond begged, clasping his hands together in front of his chest. "I know about the blind trust. I know Dad moved the real cash into an account for you. You have to use it. You have to bail me out. They are taking everything. They are going to put me in prison. Please, Mom, you are my mother. You have to save me." His voice echoed loudly through the foyer, a pathetic, desperate plea echoing off the marble walls. I was begging the very woman he had tried to throw onto the street just days prior. He was begging the woman he had falsely declared insane. I took one final slow sip of my champagne. I savored the crisp taste, letting the bubbles dance against my tongue. I lowered the glass and looked directly into my son's tear-filled eyes. "I told you I was giving you the house, Desmond," I said, my voice perfectly steady and loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "I never said I was giving you the keys to my empire." Desmond let out a loud, choked sob, covering his face with his hands, as the reality of his total destruction finally settled over him. "Get off my lawn," I whispered. Valerie suddenly stopped crying. She looked up from the floor, her face smeared with mascara and pure hatred. She did not look at me. She looked directly at the pathetic man kneeling on the floor. She realized in that exact moment that her ticket to high society was completely counterfeit. She realized she was legally tied to a man who was $18 million in debt. She scrambled to her feet, walked over to Desmond, and slapped him across the face with all the strength she had left in her body. The sharp crack echoed loudly, causing the collection agents to pause their work. "You ruined my life!" Valerie screamed at her husband, her voice cracking with fury. "I want a divorce! I want a divorce tomorrow morning." She did not wait for an answer. She turned around, kicked off her expensive silver heels, and ran out the open front doors, sprinting down the long, dark driveway in her bare feet, leaving her entire fake life behind her. Desmond stayed on his knees, weeping silently onto the hardwood floor, while the collection agents continued to tag every single item he thought he owned. From the shadows of the hallway, my grandson Isaiah stepped forward. He walked past his weeping uncle and stood proudly beside me. He held a secure tablet in his hand, and he wore a smile that looked exactly like his grandfather's. "Nana," Isaiah said, his voice calm and professional. "I just received confirmation from the federal authorities. The FBI task force received my complete data packet regarding the forged bank documents and the medical bribery. They are pulling up to the back gates right now." I smiled and patted my grandson's arm. "Excellent work, Isaiah," I said. "It seems the party is finally coming to a close." After the federal vehicles disappeared, the mansion looked larger than it ever had. The chandeliers were still blazing, but without music, and conversation, their light felt almost clinical. Half-filled glasses stood everywhere. Napkins lay on the floor where guests had dropped them. One of Valerie's ice sculptures had begun melting into a silver tray, sending a slow line of water across the catering table. Clara emerged from the service corridor with 2 members of the staff. She looked at the red attachment tags, the broken glass, and the abandoned decorations, then looked at me. Neither of us needed to say what the house had endured. The civil recovery team did not simply strip the estate indiscriminately. Harrison arrived before midnight with copies of the trust records and an inventory identifying which property belonged to the trust, which items had been purchased with diverted company funds, and which assets were personally attributable to Desmond and Valerie. That distinction mattered. The mahogany table Nathaniel and I had commissioned decades earlier was not theirs to satisfy a personal debt. Neither were family heirlooms held by the trust. The recovery officers secured the vehicle's recently purchased luxury goods accounts covered by the writ, and other assets tied to Desmond's guarantee, while preserving disputed items pending judicial review. I watched the process carefully because I had spent my entire life insisting that power be documented. I was not going to become careless merely because the court order now favored me. By 2 a.m, the front doors finally closed. Isaiah and I sat in the kitchen, not the formal dining room, each holding a mug of coffee. He looked exhausted. For the first time since he arrived at the Ritz with his backpack and laptops, he allowed himself to be 23 again. He asked me whether I regretted letting the confrontation become so public. I told him I regretted that Desmond had made public proof necessary. Had my son confessed before the board restored the money and accepted responsibility, the outcome could have been different. But once he used a fraudulent diagnosis to strip me of credibility, secrecy became another weapon in his hands. The people who had heard I was incompetent needed to see that claim collapse. The board needed evidence. The lenders needed valid documents. Investigators needed records. There had been no single dramatic piece of paper capable of solving all of it. I also told Isaiah something he did not expect. Winning did not feel joyful. It felt quiet. Desmond was still my son, and the fact that he had betrayed me did not erase 42 years of memories. I remembered teaching him to ride a bicycle on the circular drive. I remembered Nathaniel carrying him asleep from the car after school trips. I remembered the first small office we gave him at the company, and how proud I had been when his name appeared on the door. Those memories did not excuse what he had done, but they prevented me from turning him into a cartoon villain in my own mind. He had made a long series of selfish choices, and each choice made the next one easier. Accountability meant allowing those choices to reach him. Before dawn, I left the estate again. The property was still subject to active civil orders and evidence preservation, and I did not want sentiment interfering with the legal process. Thomas drove me back to the hotel while Isaiah went to meet investigators. The city was nearly empty. Delivery trucks moved through intersections under yellow streetlights, beginning another workday. I watched one tractor trailer bearing the Montgomery National Logistics logo merge onto the highway. That sight gave me the first real sense of relief I had felt all week. The company was still moving. Thousands of people were waking up to ordinary jobs, unaware of how close one man's greed had come to placing their work inside a predatory lender's liquidation file. Whatever happened to Desmond in court, that was the result I cared about most. 6 months later, the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung shut behind me, cutting off the noise of the busy Atlanta traffic. I walked into the courtroom and took my seat in the front row, keeping my posture perfectly straight. Desmond sat at the defense table, looking smaller and weaker than I had ever seen him. The expensive custom-tailored suits were completely gone, replaced by a standard-issue tan prison jumpsuit. His defense attorney stood up and tried to sell the jury a desperate, ridiculous story of temporary insanity. The lawyer claimed that the immense pressure of managing a global logistics empire had completely fractured Desmond's fragile mind. He pointed a sharp, aggressive finger directly at me, arguing that I had maliciously tricked a mentally compromised man into signing a toxic legal trap. Desmond actually managed to squeeze out a few fake, pathetic tears for the jury box, claiming he was just a deeply confused son trying to protect his aging, sick mother from herself. The prosecution called their star witness to the stand. Isaiah walked down the center aisle carrying his sleek metal briefcase with absolute confidence. He swore to tell the truth and sat in the witness box projecting a calm, terrifying authority. The lead prosecutor asked Isaiah to explain the massive financial discrepancies discovered during the mandatory transition audit. Isaiah connected his secure digital tablet to the courtroom monitors and lit up the large screens with undeniable proof. Isaiah walked the jury through the complex blockchain ledgers line by line, translating the data into simple, undeniable facts. He showed them the exact internet protocol addresses, proving Desmond initiated the offshore cryptocurrency transfers directly from the secure network inside his luxury penthouse. The defense attorney jumped up and objected loudly, citing circumstantial evidence and demanding the visual displays be turned off immediately. Isaiah calmly pressed a single button on his tablet. He projected a series of date-stamped encrypted text messages between Desmond and the offshore brokers, proving absolute premeditated intent to defraud the company. The defense attorney slowly sat back down in his leather chair, completely silenced by the sheer weight of the overwhelming evidence. Next, Isaiah methodically dismantled the fraudulent medical directive that started this entire war. He pulled up a hidden banking ledger and highlighted a massive illegal wire transfer. He showed the jury a $50,000 deposit landing in an unlisted offshore account owned exclusively by Dr. Sterling. The precise timestamp on the transfer was exactly 48 hours before the corrupt doctor signed the official paperwork declaring me mentally incompetent. Isaiah then projected the raw metadata from the $15 million commercial loan agreement. He proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that my electronic signature was applied to the contract while I was giving a live keynote speech at a major supply chain conference in Chicago. He tracked the specific global positioning system coordinates of Desmond's cell phone, proving my son executed the forgery while sitting in a private VIP gaming room at an out-of-state casino. The jury watched the entire illusion of the concerned loyal son burn to ash right in front of their eyes. Desmond stopped crying and stared blankly at the scarred wooden defense table. He knew there was absolutely no escaping the digital blood trail his brilliant nephew had systematically uncovered. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before reaching a unanimous, unyielding decision. The jury foreman stood up and read the verdict clearly into the courtroom microphone. Guilty on all charges, including aggravated identity theft, corporate wire fraud, and criminal embezzlement. The federal judge adjusted her thick reading glasses and looked down at my son with absolute unfiltered disgust. She stated clearly for the official court record that his actions represented a predatory and calculated abuse of family trust. She slammed her heavy wooden gavel down onto the sounding block and sentenced Desmond to 10 years in federal prison, followed by supervised release and substantial restitution obligations. The armed bailiff stepped forward immediately and clamped the heavy steel handcuffs tightly over his wrists. I watched them march my son out the side door without offering him a single word of goodbye or a final glance of pity. Dr. Sterling faced his own brutal execution in a different courtroom across the polished marble hall. The state medical board permanently revoked his medical license before his criminal trial even officially began. He was swiftly sentenced to 5 years in prison for medical fraud and criminal conspiracy. The arrogant man who tried to lock me in a sterile assisted living facility was now permanently locked inside a tiny concrete federal cell. Valerie faced her own devastating reckoning in family court exactly 2 weeks later. She walked into the divorce hearing wearing a modest beige dress, attempting to flawlessly play the role of the innocent betrayed wife. She confidently demanded 50% of the remaining marital assets and indefinite monthly spousal support to maintain her lifestyle. She looked directly at the family court judge and swore under penalty of perjury that she had absolutely no prior knowledge of her husband's massive criminal activities. My relentless legal team stepped forward and handed the judge the unredacted financial ledgers Isaiah had meticulously compiled during his forensic audit. The judge reviewed the thick stack of documents, and his expression turned to solid stone. The digital files proved definitively that Valerie personally authorized the massive wire transfers to the Eastern European black market syndicates. Her own physical signature was explicitly required on the international shipping manifests for the smuggled designer goods she paraded around town. She had actively managed the illicit offshore accounts to seamlessly fund her fake high society lifestyle while pretending to be completely ignorant of the theft. The judge looked down at Valerie and delivered the legal reality she had spent months denying. The evidence tied her directly to diverted corporate money, smuggled luxury goods, and transactions she had personally authorized. The court therefore rejected her attempt to claim the benefits of the spending while disowning its consequences. Her claims for indefinite support were denied property traceable to stolen funds, remained subject to restitution and forfeiture, and separate civil judgments, arising from her own participation, left her responsible for obligations she could not shift onto me or the company. The divorce decree was finalized without the fortune Valerie expected to collect. By the time restitution claims, forfeiture orders, legal fees, and civil judgments were accounted for, she left the courthouse effectively penniless, without the imported car's designer wardrobe or elite social position she had treated as permanent. The high society acquaintances she had bribed with stolen jewelry stopped returning her calls. She was exiled from the world she had tried to enter by using my family and my company as a private bank. 3 weeks later, I happened to see Valerie through the front window of a discount clothing store on the outskirts of Atlanta. She was behind a register in a plain uniform scanning clearance items while a customer argued about a coupon. Her hair was pulled back, her nails were chipped, and the exhaustion on her face was obvious even from the sidewalk. She looked up and recognized me. For a second, we simply looked at each other through the glass. During the worst days of our fight, I had imagined a moment like that as a final victory. I thought seeing her stripped of the party's cars, jewelry, and invitations would feel like balance. It did not. I felt distance, not triumph. I kept walking. The job behind that register was not punishment. Honest work never was. Men and women did difficult jobs every day without deserving anyone's contempt, and I refused to adopt the same arrogance Valerie had shown Clara and my drivers. What Valerie had lost was the illusion that status could substitute for character. She could no longer buy access with stolen money, use my son's title as a weapon, or turn my home into proof that she belonged above other people. Whatever she built next would have to be built without my company paying for the costume. That was consequence enough. I did not need to watch her suffer. I only needed her to stop feeding on what belonged to others. By the time Thomas opened the car door for me at the next corner, I had already stopped thinking about her. There was still a company to protect and a home to reclaim. That realization changed the meaning of the entire fight for me. Desmond and Valerie had spent months measuring human worth by access, who sat at the head of the table, who held the title, who wore the bracelet, who entered the club, who controlled the house. I had nearly allowed their values to shape my revenge. I did not want that. The strongest answer was not to prove I could humiliate them more effectively. It was to remove their ability to harm the people and institutions they had exploited, then return my attention to the work that mattered. Justice had already spoken through the audit, the courtrooms, and the consequences of their own signatures. I did not need a second ending built from cruelty. The morning after that final glimpse of Valerie, I instructed Thomas to drive me back to the Buckhead estate. The heavy iron gates parted smoothly as the black sedan rolled up the long circular driveway. The massive stone mansion stood proudly under the bright Georgia sun, completely cleansed of the dark, chaotic energy that had briefly infected its halls. I stepped out of the car and walked up the marble steps, feeling a profound sense of ownership and absolute peace. I unlocked the heavy oak front doors and stepped into the grand foyer. The space was perfectly quiet. The lingering scent of cheap imported perfume and stale champagne was entirely gone, replaced by the comforting familiar aroma of fresh lemon oil and rich beeswax. Ms. Clara was waiting for me near the base of the sweeping staircase. She wore her crisp professional uniform, but her eyes held the warm, fierce loyalty of a lifelong friend. We did not exchange unnecessary pleasantries or dwell on the past. We simply looked at each other and nodded, sharing a silent mutual understanding of the hard physical work that needed to be done. We refused to hire an external commercial cleaning crew for this specific task. We wanted to physically and spiritually reclaim the space with our own two hands. I walked into the formal dining room and began taking down the absurdly garish modern art pieces the former occupants had hastily nailed to the pristine walls. Clara and I worked side by side, carrying the ugly, heavy canvases directly out the back door and tossing them unceremoniously into the large curbside sanitation bins. We stripped the tacky, synthetic silk curtains from the floor-to-ceiling windows and opened the glass panes wide, letting the crisp, fresh morning breeze sweep through the entire first floor. We meticulously polished the custom mahogany dining table until the wood gleamed like dark liquid glass. We carried my late husband's favorite vintage leather armchairs out of the dusty storage closets and returned them to their rightful places of honor in the front parlor. With every piece of furniture we restored and every room we reclaimed, the heavy, oppressive weight of the recent betrayal lifted higher and higher off my shoulders. The house was finally breathing again. By early afternoon, the physical restoration of the estate was fully complete. I walked down the quiet hallway and entered the main executive study at the back of the house. I ran my hand along the smooth, polished edge of the massive wooden desk that had served as the command center for our family empire for over 3 decades. I sat down in the high-backed leather chair and opened the secure bottom drawer. I reached past the standard legal files and pulled out a heavy, dark blue velvet box. A gentle, respectful knock sounded at the study door. Isaiah walked into the room carrying 2 steaming cups of black coffee. He set them down on the desk and took a seat in the leather chair opposite mine. He did not look like a college student anymore. The brutal, high-stakes corporate warfare we had just navigated together had forged him into a hardened, brilliant professional. His posture was perfectly straight, and his eyes carried the same sharp, unwavering intelligence that had made his grandfather a legendary force in the Atlanta business community. I opened the dark blue velvet box and pushed it smoothly across the polished wood of the desk. Resting inside on a bed of pristine white satin were the master encrypted access keycards and the primary digital hardware fobs for the entire Montgomery National Logistics Global Network. I looked directly into my grandson's eyes. I told him that true corporate leadership is never an inherited blood right. I explained that supreme executive power is a massive, heavy burden that must be earned through absolute loyalty, razor-sharp competence, and an unwavering commitment to the working people who actually build the wealth. He had stood boldly by my side when the rest of the world thought I was a broken, defenseless old woman. He had used his brilliant analytical mind to surgically dismantle a multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy and shield our family legacy from total annihilation. I officially appointed Isaiah as the new executive vice president of the corporation. I informed him that he would immediately assume full operational control of the domestic supply chain divisions and personally lead the upcoming international expansion initiatives. I watched his strong, steady hands reach out and accept the velvet box. He did not boast or smile arrogantly. He simply nodded with deep, profound respect and promised me he would protect and continuously multiply the foundation we had fought so viciously to secure. The future of the logistics empire was officially locked in the safest, most capable hands possible. I stood up from the desk and walked over to the tall, expansive windows, looking out over the sprawling, vibrant green lawns of the estate. The warm afternoon sun cast long, beautiful shadows across the perfectly manicured gardens. I felt a massive surge of incredible, unstoppable energy coursing through my veins, ready for whatever business battles came next. Society tells women my age to step aside, sit in a rocking chair, and hand over our life's work to ungrateful children. I learned something different. Age did not make me powerless. Experience taught me where power actually lived. Desmond inherited the consequences of every choice he made, while Isaiah inherited something far more valuable than money: the responsibility to protect what generations before him had built. I stood at the window of my own home, listening to the quiet hum of a company still moving freight across the country, and understood that Nathaniel's legacy had survived, because when betrayal came through my own front door, I refused to surrender the keys.